Hi, my name is Caleb, and today I'll be talking about characterizing Eastern Wood-Pewee habitat on working lands in Kespukwitk. The Eastern Wood-Pewee was classified as special concern by Kespukwitk in 2012 and vulnerable by Nova Scotia's Endangered Species Act in 2013. Widespread population declines in aerial insectivores, birds that feed on flying insects, including the Eastern Wood-Pewee, have been well documented and are likely the result of a myriad of factors. One of the likely factors contributing to the decline of this species in Nova Scotia is habitat degradation due to silviculture. To undertake adequate habitat stewardship for our Eastern Wood-Pewee breeding population, we need detailed knowledge of their breeding habitat and distribution. The purpose of this study was to obtain this information in order to inform beneficial management practices for Eastern Wood-Pewees in forestry and to build robust models for protecting Eastern Wood-Pewee habitat in Kespukwitk. We collected detailed habitat information during field surveys conducted late in the summer of 2021. We selected 34 sites based on locations where we or our partners found Eastern Wood-Pewees singing during the 2020 or 2021 breeding seasons. Of these 34 sites, 15 were on Crown land, shown in red on our map, and 19 were on private woodlands, shown in yellow. Our survey plot consisted of 4 50-meter transect lines radiating from the plot center in the 4 cardinal directions. Along these lines, coarse woody debris that crossed the line was measured for diameter and decay class. And a factor 2 prism was used to count in snags, for which we would record height, DVH, cavity presence, and decay class. Near the end of each 50-meter transect, we estimated the cover of coniferous and deciduous species in the different forest layers. At the center and at the end of each transect, we measured the cover of ground vegetation species in a 1x1 quadrat. We also took 4 densitometer readings to quantify canopy closure, and we set up a prism plot using a factor 2 prism to count in trees and recorded their species, DBH, height, and health. Finally, the FEC Vegetation Type and the FEC Soil Type were determined at the center of each plot. The area we sampled had a radius of about 60 meters, considering the tree prism plots were placed 50 meters from the center and extended about 10 meters beyond that point. A study by Falconer in 2020 in Ontario found the average territory size of wood-pewees was 1.76 hectares. If this average territory was circular, it would have a radius of about 75 meters. So it is likely that our birds' territories extended a bit beyond the areas sampled. So our samples may have not included all of the forest canopy gaps in their territory, but it should have captured a substantial portion of their territory. Okay, so first we will look at the forest ecosystem classification, FEC for short, and what this tells us about the sites. 62% of the sites were softwood, with spruce-pine forests being the most common among those. 18% were mixedwood and 20% were hardwood vegetation types. The most common FEC soil types were ST9 and ST5, which accounted for 22 of the 34 sites. Overall, the sites had rich, fresh to moist soil. Okay, now we can look at some forest characteristics. The average canopy height across all sites was 17 meters, with emergent trees averaging 23 meters. Tree height is relevant in light of other studies. In Ontario, Falconer and Knoll reported in 2020 that successfully breeding Eastern Wood-Pewees nested in mature, taller trees with greater diameter at breast height, and placed nests further away from the tree trunk than did pairs whose nests failed due to predation. The average tree DBH in our sites was 32 centimeters for softwood and 25 centimeters for hardwoods, or 29 centimeters overall. So there appeared to be plenty of trees of suitable maturity across our sites. Stand density is another important forest characteristic, not only to define foraging space for pewees, but to communicate habitat requirements to our forestry partners. Basal area is the most common way to describe tree density in a stand. The basal areas were used to calculate the percent composition of each tree species. The 2 most common species, white pine and red maple, had average basal areas that together comprised 40% of all tree species across our survey sites. Basal area per hectare averaged 21 meters squared per hectare, and was larger on private lands at 23 than on Crown lands at 19. This is interesting because Falconer in 2010 concluded that habitat in Eastern Canada needed to have basal areas of 23 to 26 meters squared per hectare, with large mature trees to support Eastern Wood-Pewee's territories. After looking at the forest characteristics, we asked, is it possible to identify potential breeding habitat without the need of lengthy field surveys? And to answer this question, we compared our field data to provincial forest inventory data. The percentage of white pine and red spruce were similar in the two data sets, but differences were noted for most other species. The forest inventory underestimated balsam fir, red maple, eastern hemlock, red oak, and white birch, but overestimated black spruce, white spruce, eastern larch, sugar maple, and gray birch. Softwood basal area, and thus total basal area, was overestimated by the FID. Crown closure and canopy height appeared to be underestimated in the FID, and the field measured median canopy closure was 66%, whereas it was 58% in the FID. However, many attributes were similar in the two data sets, including hardwood basal area, softwood volume, hardwood volume, total volume, and the percent hardwood and softwood. Therefore, we concluded that the FID should be helpful in identifying Eastern Wood-Pewee breeding habitat through GIS analyses and habitat modeling. For a more complete picture of our sites, we assessed the vertical structure of the forest. The vertical profile shows a multi-layered canopy, which is typical of more mature or older forests. The emergent layer tended to be more coniferous, while the main canopy and subcanopy were somewhat more deciduous. Other studies in Ontario and the Maritimes found that Eastern Wood-Pewees preferred deciduous or mixed wood forests. However, the result of our strata assessment, along with the results of the FEC and tree species data, suggest a different habitat preference than other regions. In Kespukwitk, they appear to prefer conifer-dominated mixed wood or mixed wood stands. Snags and downcourse wood debris differed somewhat for crown and private lands. More of it was in the later stage of decay on private lands. We found twice as many snags on private lands, although average snag size as measured by DBH and height were similar. For pewees, canopy gaps are thought to be important for foraging space. Crown closure averaged 66% across our sites, and canopy gaps along our transects were common but small, like treefall gap, where one or a few trees have fallen. The gap size will be worth measuring in the future. A study by Campbell colleagues in 2007 documented changes in the number of territories of forest birds following group selection harvests in the Holt Research Forest in Maine, where tree species composition appears similar to that of Kespukwitk. Their gaps averaged 210 meters squared, which corresponds to an average width of 16.4 meters. Eastern Wood-Pewees responded positively with a significant increase in the number of territories 5 to 8 years post-harvest. In Falconer's 2010 thesis on pewees, he suggested that creating and maintaining several small forest gaps, 0.02 to 0.04 hectares in size, within each hectare of mature forest. It is likely that Eastern Wood-Pewees and Kespukwitk will respond positively to ecological forestry practices that encourage harvesting to create small canopy gaps. What we don't know is whether the gap sizes in the new forestry guidelines are too big for pewee. Some important conclusions from this study are the following. First, we found that Eastern Wood-Pewee habitat in Kespukwitk is more coniferous than it has been reported in other regions, and we did not find any association of Eastern Wood-Pewees with forested wetlands or riparian forests. Second, we found that the Nova Scotia forest inventory data was largely congruent with field data, so the FID layer should be useful in modeling Eastern Wood-Pewee breeding habitat, and that this information will be used to inform beneficial management practices for forestry. Thirdly, our results support previous findings that suggest that Eastern Wood-Pewees would benefit from the creation of small canopy gaps in enclosed canopy forest. However, specifying maximum beneficial gap size will require further study. And finally, I would like to acknowledge the financial, logistical, and field support that made this project possible. Thank you so much for listening.